Hello and welcome to the Poetry Podcast. Please enjoy these excerpts from our Seamus Heaney episode. We're at poetrypause.org.
And I think that sense of being rooted to home and to family and a sense of being somewhere else is something that continues throughout his work.
Yes.
The kind of, it's not quite a tension, but it's there, it's underlying. The two senses of him as somebody who lives in a rural community with closely knit family and the kind of man of letters that we discussed before. So
sort of parallel lives, really, aren't they? You know, it's very interesting. I mean, he went on to achieve, his first book was Death of a Naturalist, wasn't it, which was published to great acclaim and won awards. And then he published 12 big collections, all with Faber. And that includes his poem Digging. Billy Collins said this was a poem where he said he found his voice, that he believed only Seamus Heaney could have written Digging. Yeah. And it does combine those two aspects that you just mentioned, I think.
He himself recognised conflict, a lot of conflict inside himself, which started, he said, from home where his father was a cattle dealer, a farmer, and didn't say much. His mother was from a more, if you like, industrial background and did all the talking. So there was that conflict of peace and quiet and perhaps noise. And then the neighbours, they were a big Catholic family, the Heaneys, and their neighbours, quite a few were Protestants, and obviously they were friends and colleagues in the farming community. And then, as you say, being sent away from home and having to be independent, and then going to university in Belfast, so that he was in a big city, really from the age of 12 in Derry and then in Belfast, that he found a lot of conflict within himself, and he recognised that as where his poetry came from, where all these different tensions.
So he won 18 awards, including the 1995 Nobel Prize for Literature, which he described to friends as the N thing. Yeah. And I think that's very endearing. You know, he sounds like he was a modest man, doesn't he? He couldn't quite bring himself to say that he'd won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he moved to Southern Ireland in 1972, to Glanmore, with his wife, Mary, who was also a writer and a teacher, wasn't she? And they had 3 children. When he died, RTE broadcasted the funeral on radio, and I think there was a 3-minute silence at Dublin's football ground, because he was a big football man, and he was so beloved. And I read somewhere that at one point, I think it was around about 2006, something like 2/3 of the poetry books.
I think that was when he was 70. That 2/3 of the poetry collections sold in Britain
were by Seamus Heaney.
Yeah. By Seamus Heaney.
Incredible.
And that's not just that's probably not in Ireland. It's in, what was and he was careful to point it out, an almost foreign country.
Yes, yeah. He was a massive poetry rock star, wasn't he?
It's interesting that, because it's communal, isn't it? It's like the thought of poets sat on their own somewhere, kind of torturing over things, rather than a community of, like we're doing now, discussing and sharing thoughts and ideas. Because he also says that the completely solitary self, that's where poetry comes from. So it's another, not tension, but another opposition in a way, the two things.
Yeah, kind of contradiction.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all great art and creativity comes from a contradiction, actually, and we should be quite worried as creatives if we feel like utterly happy bunnies, because it might mean that we haven't got any itches to scratch.
Yeah, what's to write about?
Yes, yeah. So could Seamus Heaney only be Irish?
He was quintessentially Irish, but there could be other people like him from other, you can imagine a rural English, rural Welsh person producing poetry.
I get a sense of Celticness from him.
Obviously, he was living through the Troubles. He was Catholic. How did he kind of negotiate his role as, almost a cultural icon with his religion and political causes? What do we know about that or think about that? Because he wasn't a spokesman for republicanism, was he?
No,
by any
he
means?
didn't want to. He didn't want to be. He wanted to write about what he saw and what he felt, but not actually to be leading any kind of movement other than a poetic one.
Mm-hmm. And he was asked to be poet laureate, wasn't he, in Britain, and turned it down.
Was that the occasion when he wrote the letter saying that he was never British but always Irish?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very clear throughout that where he's from and what his personal belief system is. But, he said poetry doesn't function well as exposure and accusation. That's not what he wanted his work to be.
No.